Peggy Orenstein is the New York Times best-selling author of Cinderella Ate My Daughter, Waiting for Daisy, and Schoolgirls. Still a classic cornerstone work of girls' studies 20 years after it was first published. And she is author of the newly published and now critically acclaimed Girls and Sex, which again, we're selling over there. It's an amazing book, very eye-opening in terms of what's happening for girls today and the hypersexualization of girls. Peggy is also a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. She has been published in USA Today, Parenting Salon, The New Yorker, and other publications, and has contributed commentaries to NPR's All Things Considered. Orenstein has appeared on myriad shows from Today to Fox and Friends to CNN. An author of Girls and Sex. We are so lucky to have Peggy Orenstein with us to close this incredible day that we've all had together. And without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Peggy onto the stage.
That's a bright light. Did you guys see this? Real talk about sex? This is very exciting. I like this. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you because, my job is to take girls' stories and to amplify them and to broadcast them out there so that people can hear their voices and find out what they need. And you all then are providing the happily ever after. Not with the prince, but you know what I mean. But the work that you do is so important, so necessary, and it always gives me, so many of you have been resources for me so that when people ask me questions at events, I can say, oh yes, well you need to go to this resource and you need to go to that resource. So you're all the best, thank you. And I was gonna just start out and give my sort of talk that I've been developing on girls and sex, but since you are my people, I am in a state of rage today because I just saw that, did you see the Well blog, the New York Times Well blog yesterday? They had this article about how rates of labiaplasty have skyrocketed among teenage girls. They've gone up 200%. Now, first of all, when I first wrote Girls and Sex, I had to say, what's labiaplasty? Because I saw that it was going up, but I didn't even know what it was. So for those of you who don't know what it is, it's the trimming of the labia majora and labia minora to make a tight, kind of closed-looking thing. The most popular version of it, it's called the Barbie because it makes a clamshell effect, and because Barbie, as you know, is made of plastic and has no genitalia. So it's supposed to look like that. But so these girls, so it's gone up so that whereas overall, teenage girls are not a big part of the plastic surgery world, but overall they're 2%, but in labiaplasty they're 5%, and the American Academy of Pediatrics has been forced to release a statement about it. And on one hand, these girls are kind of outliers, right? There's not that many of them, and it's extreme behavior. On the other hand, I felt like they are canaries in the coal mine of the shame, self-loathing, and objectification surrounding female sexuality in this culture. And they're engaging, these are American girls who are engaging in self-inflicted genital mutilation. So, I don't know, I'm just totally appalled by that. And I talk a lot in Girls and Sex. So much of my work is about the difference between the imperative to present as sexy versus understanding any concept if you're developing sexuality. And in Girls and Sex, I talk a lot about the idea of hot and how important hot becomes to girls as they're getting older, that hot has to precede everything. So in a study of Princeton, leadership at Princeton a few years ago, they found that girls going out to leadership, that the percentage of girls taking leadership positions had dropped. And when they looked into it over the past decade, they found that young women felt that it wasn't enough to be qualified, but they had to do everything well, and look perfectly hot while doing it. So it's, we know that it undermines girls' mental health. But what's different now, hot tells girls that how their bodies look to somebody else is more important than how that body feels to themselves. And whereas those of us who are Gen X parents or baby boom parents would have pushed back against that message as self-objectification or self-sexualization, it's sold to today's girls as self-confidence and empowerment. So, for instance, one of the young women that I interviewed talked about going to, how when she goes to a party, she showed me a picture, and she was wearing short skirt, crop top, sky-high heels, and she said, "I'm proud of my body, and I never feel more liberated than when I'm wearing skimpy clothing." And I said, "Okay, well, let's talk about that some more." And a few minutes later, she said, "Yeah, but a year ago, I wouldn't have worn this outfit because I was 25 pounds heavier," and what she said was some jerky boy would have called me the fat girl. So then I had to say, well, then who gets to be proud of which body, under what circumstances, and how liberating can that really be when humiliation lurks just around the corner? And because girls were always engaged in that dance of, is this liberating or is this limiting, that confidence often came off with their clothes. So thinking about that labiaplasty trend, which really has come up because of the expectation that's driven by porn that girls won't have any pubic hair, so suddenly they can see what's going on under there. I think a lot about when women first started shaving their armpits and legs. And that happened in the 1920s, because that was when flapper fashions first revealed our limbs. Before that, women were completely covered. So when our arms and our legs became open to public scrutiny, we suddenly needed to prepare them and make them look a certain way. And so this makes me feel very much like girls' most intimate parts are now becoming public, open to scrutiny, that how they look to others, again, is more important than how they feel to themselves. And it's particularly galling when, we not only have a female presidential candidate, but we have male presidential candidates who are in public during their debates talking about the size of their penises. And we know in the girl community that self-objectification, self-sexualization is damaging to girls. We know that. We know it undermines them cognitively. We know it undermines their mental health. We know it encourages depression, anxiety, body image issues. And the kicker is, girls who buy into ideas of self-objectification and self-sexualization report lower rates of sexual satisfaction as well. So honestly, who cares about how proud you are of your body if you don't understand its responses? So back to what I did when I wrote Girls and Sex. I was coming off of writing Cinderella Ate My Daughter, and a lot of that book was about how the pretty, sparkly pink culture of little girlhood was telling girls that how they looked was more important than who they were, and how that was preparing girls for a more sexualized adolescence. And meanwhile, I'm a parent, and I was hearing from friends of older kids about hookup culture and binge drinking and assault and sexting, and my reaction was kind of to want to go, "Oh, I don't want to hear it, just don't tell me about it, I don't want to know." Because parenting from ignorance and fear is always a really good idea. So I decided that wasn't the right way to go. And meanwhile, we were having this overarching conversation in our culture about consent. And, that is such an important conversation, so vital, so important, affirmative consent. And, it really should be a starting point. Consent is kind of a low bar for a sexual experience when you think about it. Like, I was not assaulted. That's a pretty low bar for a sexual experience. So thinking about all that, I really wanted to find out what happened after yes. And the girls that I talked to, I went around the country, and I chose girls on purpose who were college-bound or in college, who were between 15 and 20. And they spanned a pretty broad ethnic spectrum. But I chose that more entitled group because I wanted to talk to girls who we think of as having opportunity. I wanted to talk to girls who we think of as being the beneficiaries of the feminist movement. Because if these girls who were so driven, so bright, so empowered in the classroom, had such ambitions outside of the classroom, could bandy about language like gender non-binary and slut shaming and all of that, they were leaning in all over the place. But if they were toppling in their private life, then it would be very hard to deny that there was an issue. But the research is just as applicable to other girls, to lower income girls, to immigrant girls who experiences even more silenced, more pathologized, and are at least as subject to exploitation by boys and men in the sexual realm. So one of my main findings was that the girls I met felt entitled to engage in sexual behavior, but they didn't feel entitled necessarily to enjoy it. So one of the young women that I talked to said, for instance, I come from generations of strong women. My grandmother was a firecracker. My mother is really strong. My sister and I, we're loud, and that's our form of feminine power. And then she proceeded to narrate to me her sex life, which was a series of sort of unsatisfying, vaguely demeaning, non-reciprocal hookups. And she said, I don't know, I think we girls are just socialized to be docile creatures who can't express our wants. And I said, 5 minutes ago, you just told me what a strong woman you are. And she said, yeah, I know, but nobody ever told me that strong woman image should apply to sex. So I frame the book with the idea of intimate justice. And that's a notion that I got from a psychologist in Michigan named Sarah McClellan. And just like, as feminists we know who does the dishes in your home or who vacuums the rug in your home is a political act as well as a personal one. In the same way, sex has power dynamics too. And it touches on these fundamental issues of gender inequality, of economic disparity, of violence, autonomy, physical and mental health, and power dynamics in our most personal relationships. And what intimate justice wants us to ask, and what I asked persistently throughout the work, was who is entitled to engage in a sexual experience? Who is entitled to enjoy that experience? Who is the primary beneficiary of that experience? And how does each partner define good enough? And honestly, those can be really difficult and painful questions for us to ask of ourselves as adult women. But when you're talking about young girls and those early foundational first experiences, I just felt like I don't want their early experiences to have to be something that they need to get over. So one thing that was really clear to me was that we have to broaden our definition of sex when we talk to young women and young men beyond intercourse. Because actually, despite the hype, kids are actually not having intercourse younger, and they're not having more intercourse than they used to. But they are engaging in other behavior. And by ignoring and denying that, by allowing kids to label other acts as not sex, then they aren't subject to the same rules. And that opens the door to both risky behavior and lack of respect. And that's particularly true of oral sex, which teenagers now consider less intimate than intercourse, at least if boys are on the receiving end. The young women I met had a lot of reasons for engaging in non-reciprocal oral sex. It made them feel desired. It boosted their social status. It helped avoid the emotional intimacy they feared would happen with intercourse, what kids called catching feelings, like it was a disease. It could also be a way to get out of an uncomfortable situation. So as one college freshman told me, sometimes you'll do it at the end of an evening when you don't want to have sex with a guy, but he expects to be satisfied, which is a statement that needs an awful lot unpacked when you think about it. But it wasn't just that boys wouldn't do it, it was also that girls didn't want them to. And this is where we get back to that idea of shame again. Again, going back to intimate justice too, who gets to enjoy, who is the beneficiary, how does each partner define good enough? It's interesting to know that when you look at when we talk about sexual satisfaction, we think that we're talking about one thing. And we're not. Sexual satisfaction is a gendered idea. And young women are more likely than young men to measure their sexual satisfaction by their partner's pleasure. So they'll say, he had a good time, so I had a good time. Young men are more likely than young women to measure their satisfaction by their own pleasure. So I had a good time, so I had a good time. When they talk about bad sex, too, young women use words, young men will say things like, well, my partner wasn't that hot, or, or I didn't have an orgasm. But young women use words like pain, humiliation, degradation, and young men never use those words. So when young women report sexual satisfaction levels that are equal to or greater than young men's, as they do in the research, that may be deceptive from an intimate justice perspective. If a girl goes into an encounter hoping that it won't hurt, wanting to feel close to her partner, and expecting that he will have an orgasm, then she'll be satisfied if those criteria are met. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel close to your partner or wanting him to be happy. But again, absence of pain, a very low bar for your own sexual fulfillment. And thinking about all of this, I begin to feel that what we've done in our culture around female pleasure, I was talking earlier about this labiaplasty issue and the idea of actual physical genital mutilation, but we have performed a psychological clitoridectomy on our young women. And here's what I mean by that. So when we have children, when we have our infants, parents tend to name all the parts on a baby boy. At least they'll say, here's your pee-pee, they'll say something. But when they talk about girls, they go right from navel to knees. And they leave this whole situation in here unnamed. And there is no better way to make something unspeakable than not to name it. Then they go into puberty education classes. And typically what they learn is that boys have erections and ejaculations, and girls have periods and unwanted pregnancy. Not the same thing, really. And then you see only the internal parts, on that diagram that looks like a steer head, and it kind of grays out between the legs. So we never say vulva, we never say clitoris. Not surprisingly, fewer than half of girls aged 14 to 17 have ever masturbated. I can't imagine we would be okay with that much indifference and lack of curiosity about any other body part. And then we expect when they go into their partnered interactions that they will be able to have a sense of equality, a sense of their rights, a sense of ability to articulate their wants, their needs, their desires, their limits, and to have those respected. And, it's just not realistic. And so I got so frustrated. I actually meant to say this earlier, but I'm going to put it in now because I forgot. I got very frustrated talking to girls about the non-reciprocal oral sex thing. And after a while, one of the things I started saying to them, which I encourage you to say to young women, is, what if every time you were with a guy, he asked you to get a glass of water from the kitchen, and he never offered to get you a glass of water? Or if he did, it was like, do you want me to, get you a glass of water? You wouldn't stand for it. And they would laugh just like you did, and they would say, well, when you put it that way. And I'd say, well, why wouldn't you put it that way? Why are you more comfortable with the idea of performing a non-reciprocal sexual act on somebody than you are getting them glasses of water from the kitchen? The one place this is different, I said earlier that girls measure their satisfaction by their partner's satisfaction. That remains true when they're in same-sex encounters. So things change quite a bit when girls have same-sex encounters. And in fact, their orgasm rates are about the same as boys in heterosexual encounters. When I would talk to girls who were gay or bisexual, they would use the word script, which I found very interesting. They would say that once they got off the script, the prescribed heterosexual script that they saw in the media, that they saw all around them, that they were free to create an encounter that worked for them based on their own terms. And they talked about that as a really liberating idea and a really liberating possibility. And it was something that I thought about a lot and really thought that girls who have encounters with opposite sex partners could very much learn from. The other piece, I was saying earlier that we need to broaden our definition of sex, where we're talking about gay girls, is when we talk about virginity, when we talk about virginity as first intercourse, first of all, again, that denies all these other things that kids are doing, but it also completely dismisses gay girls, and, well, gay teens in general. And I talked to one girl and said, you know, she had never had an encounter with a boy, but she had had same-sex encounters. And I said, so how did you know you weren't a virgin anymore? And she said, well, I had to Google that. And Google didn't know. And I got to talk to Google. I got to go give a talk at Google a couple weeks ago. And I was like, you guys know that you don't have an answer for when is a lesbian not a virgin? That's a failure. But, well, so that, they didn't say anything. So it was actually the only talk I've given that was to, and I mean, I love when there's men in the room. Thank you, man in the room. But this was basically all men in the room because I guess women don't work at Google or something. But it was sort of an interest. It was an less comfortable. It's a less comfortable talk. Anyway, so here we are. Google doesn't know, and so I said, well, so what did you decide? And she said, I decided that I wasn't a virgin anymore when I had my first orgasm with a partner. And I thought, wow, what if just for a minute we thought of that as a girl's loss of virginity, how that would shift our whole conception of what sex is and ought to be. And it's about sort of creating this idea. I mean, I'm not naive. I know nobody's going to change the definition of virginity because I say so, but it's about this idea of helping girls realize, and I was at a high school just yesterday talking to girls about this, and you know, we talked for an hour and a half and they really didn't stop talking the whole time. But the idea that sex is a pool of experiences, you know, that involve warmth and closeness and arousal and affection and desire and mutuality and sensuality, and thinking about, you know, really, who is the more sexually experienced person? The person who makes out with a partner for 3 hours and experiments with erotic tension and sensation and communication, or the person who gets wasted at a party, hooks up with a random in order to lose their virginity before they go to college? You know, it's just something to bring up to girls. So in the book, I talk a lot about the hookup culture that young women are growing up in, and that's something that I think we've read a lot about in college, less so in high school, but it is increasingly moving downward. And well, first of all, hookup. Intentionally ambiguous word means absolutely nothing. It might mean, every time I interviewed a girl, I would have to say, wait, stop, define, because it might mean kissing, it might mean oral sex, it might mean intercourse, it might mean anything. And it's kept ambiguous in part because then young people don't know what the other ones are doing, and they do tend to overestimate what activities their friends are engaged in because of it. Hookup culture, what was meant by that, I mean, young people today did not invent casual sex. Am I right? What has changed is that a normalized idea that sex ought to proceed rather than arise from intimacy. And whether young women and young men decide to opt into that culture or prefer not to, they have to define their sexuality in relationship to it. And what I wanted to do was tell young women not this is how you should, you know, the situation in which you should have sex, this is a situation that you shouldn't, but to let them know what they were likely to get and not get out of that situation. Because some young women were all about it. They felt that was just what they wanted right now in their lives. Some thought it was unhygienic and disgusting, and it was a whole range. But what you're likely to get out of a hookup is an adrenaline rush, a warm body, a war story, a sense of being desired. What you're not likely to get is good sex or the tools that you need in order to create a situation where you will have good sex, or the tools that you need in order to create intimacy. So understand that instead of the glamorized hookup that you see in the culture. Understand that and think about it going in, and think about what it is that you want, which I'll tell you is a radical question to ask a girl. What do you want out of this encounter? So what do we do? I mean, I wrote a book because I believe in starting conversations. I believe in the power of words to make change. And I think of it like the food movement, where, 15 years ago, who ever heard of a free-range chicken, right? But because of a couple of books, because of Michael Pollan, because of Eric Schlosser, we all know what a free-range chicken is, right? And not everybody, not everywhere, but the idea of food justice is a thing. And it's a thing not only in alternative culture, but in mainstream culture too. It's a movement. It makes change. And I really believe that we can do that too. Because if we don't, kids will get their information from porn and from a mainstream media that's heavily influenced by porn, that constructs female sexuality as a performance for men, that distorts their bodies, that eroticizes humiliation. So I end the book in a classroom with Karis Dennison, who I wish was here today. She's a youth advocate in Marin, who does come to all high schools. And she shows us some amazing exercises with the kids. And I also talk a lot about the Dutch. And I do that because in comparisons of Dutch college girls and American college girls, so very similar girls, they find that on every outcome, the Dutch are superior. Fewer negative consequences like regret, disease, pregnancy, more positive consequences like knowing their partner very well, being able to communicate with their partner, caring about their partner, enjoying the experience, positive body image. And the biggest difference is that parents, teachers, and doctors talk clearly, frankly, and explicitly to kids about sex in Holland from the time they're very little. And they talk about it in the dinner table, they talk about it in the doctor's office, they talk about it in school. And a particular difference was the way parents talked, though I think that this applies to advocates too. American parents are not less comfortable talking about sex, but they're more likely to talk exclusively about risk and disease and harm. Dutch parents frame it differently. They talk about balancing responsibility and joy. And as a parent, that hit me in the gut, because I think if it weren't for that, I would have talked to my daughter about contraception, about disease protection, about consent, because I'm very modern, but I wouldn't have had that other half of the conversation. And now I will, and if I can't, I'll find somebody who can do it for me. So I know what I hope for now for girls. I want their sexuality to be a source of self-knowledge and creativity and communication, despite its risks. I want them to revel in their bodies' sensuality without being reduced to it. I want them to be able to ask for what they want in bed and to get it. I want them to be safe from disease, unwanted pregnancy, cruelty, dehumanization, and violence. If they are assaulted, I want them to have recourse with school administrators, employers, the courts. And I know that's a lot to ask for, but I don't think it's too much. And as activists and advocates, we encourage girls to have a voice and to expect egalitarian treatment in the home, in the classroom, and in the workplace. Now it's time to demand that intimate justice in their personal lives as well. Thank you.